Please remember that nothing we say here should be taken as personal advice. The conversation is for entertainment purposes only. If you have questions about your financial situation, please talk to a licensed financial advisor. All right, welcome to another episode of Future Money, where we talk about the investments of the future
that will make us money. I could not be happier today. I have a really amazing guest that was really a gift to us, especially in a time like this when there is so much geopolitical issues and a lot of stuff going on. Usually my partner Eyal is here, but he's not here today. So it's going to be just me and John Emerson. So I'll give a little intro to John, and then I'm let him give his own background. But ultimately, John is the vice chair at Capital Group, over 22 years in industry experience in the financial services industry. He was also United States ambassador to Germany from 2013 and 2017. The list of accomplishment is so long. He is U.S. Navy Distinguished Public Service Award. He worked for ex-President Clinton and ex-President Obama, and has really a tremendous amount of experience and service within the CIA and some other trade and international groups. So, John, welcome to Future Money. Thank you again for your time today. Tell me a little bit more.
My pleasure to be with you, and thanks so much for having me.
I can't wait for this conversation. I'll let you start giving us a little bit more about your background.
Well, I'm a recovering lawyer, as they say. I started out, grew up in the East Coast and law school in Chicago, and then moved to LA and joined a law firm where I became partner. Got very involved in presidential politics and then in government. Ended up running Gary Hart's presidential campaign that didn't end all that well.
Yeah.
And then became chief deputy city attorney for Los Angeles, which is a prosecutorial office that I was running back in the late 80s and early 90s. Yeah. Ended up going into Bill Clinton's White House, was part of his senior staff in the White House for 4.5 years. I did a lot of work on international trade while I was there. And then after that, I joined Capital Group, and for about 16 years was president of the private client group, our sort of family and friends private client group that we were building. And then I was chairman of the board of the LA Music Center and quite active in sort of the nonprofit world here in Los Angeles. And then in Obama's first term, he put me on his trade advisory council. It's called Advisory Council for Trade Policy and Negotiations. So this was in the lead up to TPP and TTIP being negotiated. And then in his second term, I was appointed to be ambassador to Germany. I was there for not quite 4 years. Spent a lot of time working on trade. And it was during that time that the Ukraine war started back in 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, moved into the Donbass and all that. So people keep thinking about, well, this war started last year. No, the newest invasion started last year, but the war's been going on for quite some time. I went to Ukraine to work with the incoming government, as the German U.S. Ukrainian relationship was so important in those days. And then when I came back and rejoined Capital in this new role, I also became the chairman of the American Council on Germany. I'm on the board of the Munich Security Conference and also the German Marshall Fund. So I've kept in addition to work on the Council on Foreign Relations, I've kept my transatlantic ties very active and very fresh, if you will. And I probably spend about, 5 months a year basing in Europe and traveling to Europe and Asia, meeting with clients, doing this kind of thing as well for Capital Group, and also with regard to some of the nonprofit stuff that I'm doing. So that's probably more than you needed to know, but
that's amazing background, fantastic background. I mean, since we started there, I know you just came back from Munich from the security conference. I mean, I can't even imagine how tense things must have been right now with Ukraine and Russia. Maybe give us a lay of the land. Like, what's the conversation there?
Well, it's interesting. For those who don't know, the Munich Security Conference is sort of the Davos, the World Economic Forum of national security. And there are about 300 participants. It's not this huge thing. It pretty much all takes place in a particular hotel in Munich, with some side meetings on the margins of that. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty much all the NATO member states, heads of government, foreign ministers, defense ministers, intelligence chiefs, a number of military leaders, obviously the leadership of NATO, and then some non-NATO representatives. We had the foreign minister of China, the foreign minister of Japan, the foreign minister of Korea, all there and participating as well. And what was interesting about this particular Munich Security Conference, it was about a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine started. And the previous Munich Security Conference was right before, 4 days before the invasion.
Wow.
And of course, I was there as well. And in February of 2022, what was fascinating to me about that was that I would say 50% of the people who were there, the participants, did not buy the American intelligence report that said Russia is on the verge of invading Ukraine, and a pretty massive invasion. And when I would tell people about the intelligence that President Biden had decided to make public, everybody looked at me and go, yeah, weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, Kabul will stay. Afghanistan's not going to fall for, 6, 12, 18 months. And, so you can see why there may
mistakes,
be a little bit of skepticism, but I guess our intelligence was better on this one. It was absolutely.
It was very unique for Biden to share that much intelligence with our allies, right? Like that was
very unique. And of course, now, unfortunately, a lot of it's being inadvertently shared through this current leak, which we can talk about. By the way, I get a little PTSD on that because 6 weeks after I arrived as ambassador to Germany, news broke that we had been tapping Angela Merkel's cell phone.
Oh, yeah.
So I had this opening. That was my introduction to
Welcome.
Germany. People were not too happy with the United States at that point in time. Yeah. But in any event, you're absolutely right. It was highly unusual. And the reason he did that was to try to at least jumpstart the process of getting the EU member states and the NATO member states to be prepared in terms of sanctions regimen, everything else, with how they are going to respond to a massive invasion of Ukraine. And the good news is they were able to, the allies came together so quickly. Now, here's the interesting contrast. In 2014, when Russia seized Crimea and moved into the Donbass, I was working with Angela Merkel to try to get a sanctions regimen from the EU. And the EU, you need to, it's called a consensus organization, which I always thought consensus meant, we all kind of agree on this. No, consensus is almost like a veto situation where if one member state, Malta,
unanimous,
Estonia, whatever, says no, it doesn't happen. And so there was a lot of work to try to pull together. And what was interesting was you had resistance from a number of the EU member states back in 2014 to impose sanctions on Russia. And it didn't really happen until we had the shooting down of MH17, that commercial jetliner right over Ukraine. And it was clear that the separatists were the ones that did it. Then we got our sanctions. So it was fascinating to me to see how quickly the West came together on this. And this is the lead-in for what happened at the current Munich Security Conference, which was about a year later. And there was a lot of conversation, I would say, from the podium, a lot of patting on the back about how quickly and effectively the alliance came together. And by the way, the opening speaker was Zelensky this year, and he came in person last year. He obviously did it by video this year, but he was the opening speaker, and a lot of Ukraine must win. We're in it as long as it takes. But the dirty little secret is there was no open discussion about what do you mean by win? How do you define win?
Right.
And what is the it when we say when we say we're in it as long as it takes? There was a lot of discussion about that on the margins and in private meetings with military leaders and what have you. And I will tell you, there are different views on how you define win.
Yeah. So okay, before I'd love that point. I want to ask you more about that, because there is definitely war fatigue already. We're seeing a lot of, you know, support waning down here in the US. Even in France, we saw Macron, you know, in China this past week and so forth, and really not trying to support Ukraine as much. Like what's going on there? Are we losing that coalition?
Not yet.
Not yet.
The thing about the coalition, but this gets back to how you define win and what's the it. So the the coalition, you know, is very solidly together at this point, even though you have some people in some of the European states that are complaining about energy prices and that kind of thing, and how much money this is costing. And even though you have both the two frontrunners for the Republican presidential nomination recently saying Ukraine is not in the vital national security interest of the United States.
DeSantis got in trouble for that, though.
We had Mitch McConnell, leader of the Republicans in the Senate, who was at the Munich Security Conference. I was in a very small discussion with him where he made clear, as he put it, the death of the interventionist wing of the Republican Party is greatly overstated. And he said, don't pay attention to Twitter. Don't pay attention to the extremes. The leadership of the Republican Party in the Congress is very much in support of Ukraine and continuing to support Ukraine. But again, it begs the question of for how long. And I think, you know, there's a couple of things came out of this that I think would be of interest to your listeners. Number one, if we end up with a long war of attrition, that benefits Vladimir Putin.
Right.
It benefits him because he can throw more bodies at it.
Sure.
It benefits him because while the West Ukraine's just burning through ammunition and weapons, the West is not in a position to just keep pumping it in an ending period of time.
Yeah.
Whereas Putin has put Russia on a Russians industrial base on a kind of a war footing, and they're just chunking these things out every single day. So number one, you've got that dynamic. The second dynamic is that he's betting that over time Europe will get tired of this.
Yep.
And over time, you may see a change in governance in the United States. And with all due respect to Senator Mitch McConnell, if a Republican president or a Republican gets elected president saying, or a Democrat, but I mean, Biden clearly is very committed to this, saying Ukraine is not in our national interest, that will begin to change the dynamic in Congress, what has so far been a very strong bipartisan dynamic of support for Ukraine. So Putin knows that. Yeah. And one comment I've constantly hear from my European friends is never underestimate the capacity of the Russian people to endure suffering.
Right.
And Vladimir Putin view, I can wait you guys out. So point number one, war of attrition benefits Putin. Yeah. Point number two, however, the Russian military has been so badly decimated that there is an opportunity, particularly as the ice thaws. And once we get out of the mud season, which is what they call this time of year in that part of the world, and the military equipment can easily travel over fields and what have you, Ukraine is very well positioned for a series of very sharply targeted counteroffensives in strategically important areas. For instance, breaking through that land bridge that Putin has been able to develop between Russia and Crimea. That would be of great strategic significance. And so we're sort of war of attrition helps Putin, but right now the advantage is with the Ukraine once everything thaws, and if they do this focused targeted attacks. And I think what's happened is the West, if you will, is waiting to see what happens there, giving Ukraine as much support as we can. That includes the Leopard tanks from Germany. That includes more HIMARS from the United States, and of course, more ammunition. But at the end of this series of countermeasures and counterattacks, I think everybody's going to sort of sit back and say, okay, what are the facts on the ground?
Right.
And is this time for us to push, China to push Putin, and for us to push Zelensky to sit down and begin conversations?
I'm glad you went there, because, we saw the defense minister from China visiting Putin last week, right? China has been lukewarm to Russia, to say the least, right? They're one of our biggest trading partner, one of Europe's biggest trading partner. Are they just kind of waiting it out? They just want to keep their options open at this point?
Well, I'll tell you, with regard to China, two facts for sure. Number one, they do not want to see Russia lose this in a humiliating fashion. Why? Because, this partnership for life without limits, obviously there are limits because they haven't supported Russia militarily here, but their partnership for life is hugely important as a long-term geopolitical objective for Xi Jinping. He wants to create sort of this alternative, non-values, non-rules-based trading environment, economic universe, and Russia would be obviously would be a part of that. If you wanted to be cynical, you could use John McCain's line of Russia will become China's gas station. And there's some truth to that. So he doesn't want to
gas at a discount, right? Like a massive
good discounts, which actually isn't bad. And so he doesn't want them to lose. On the other hand, I can't imagine he's too excited about the way this thing has progressed. No. I mean, first of all, as a geopolitical, as you point out, China very much they're going through a tough spot economically. Sure. They very much depend on their trade with Europe and the European Union, and on foreign direct investment from Europe into China, building factories and creating cars and that kind of thing. They depend on that right now. The last thing they want to do is get sideways from a sanction standpoint with Europe. And that's one reason why I think we haven't seen the military support of Russia from China, because they don't want to be sideways of sanctions when they're trying to build out of a tough economic patch that they're in. The second thing is that the last thing Xi Jinping wants, he's been trying to build a wedge between the U.S. and Europe.
Right.
Don't go down the path of decoupling that the U.S. is doing. We have a good, strong working relationship. He wants to build that wedge. And what has happened as a result of this war? Europe and the U.S. are closer than at any time since the height of the Cold War. So that's not Xi Jinping's geopolitical objective. And then the third thing, what did this war do the minute Putin went into Ukraine? It put a huge spotlight on Taiwan.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the first question I get asked when I'm out talking about this when it comes to China is, what's the likelihood they're going to invade Taiwan? I mean, people weren't really focused on that so much until Putin did it with Ukraine. They're like, oh my God, what about China and Taiwan? So Xi Jinping, on the one hand, he wants this to end because it's not in his interest. But on the other hand, he doesn't want it to end with a Russian defeat. So it's a very tricky circumstance that he's in right now.
So I'm glad you went there, because some of the biggest questions that we get as investors, as financial advisors, is one, how these geopolitical events affect the investment landscape, right? Which oftentimes they really don't, kind of markets will climb a wall of worry and so forth. But this Taiwan situation is really one that stands still, right? Taiwan I think produces 85 or 90% of all semiconductors, some of the biggest players in the space, which is basically the new oil. And this one China policy is really something that people can understand. And we get, everyone is scared about China moving into Taiwan. So is that risk not really palpable? Is that real? Is that something that we have to be worried about?
I think we have to be worried about it longer term, simply because Xi Jinping has made clear he does not want the Taiwan problem to be passed on to a new generation of leaders. He wants to resolve that during his time in office, which, he pretty much his president for life, I suppose.
So when you say Taiwan problem,
I worry about that long term. In the short term, absent some incredibly provocative action, like an independence movement really gets a head of steam going in Taiwan, I don't think it's likely that China is going to invade Taiwan in anytime soon, say the next 1 to 3 years. And the reason for that is part of what I said earlier, is that China's got their own economic challenges. The last thing they want to do is trigger the kinds of sanctions, military action, et cetera, that would inevitably result from an effort to take over Taiwan. And you mentioned something else, the semiconductor production. China's just as dependent on that as we are.
Sure.
I mean, let me tell you, you start invading that island, those semiconductors, that production stops.
Right, right.
And the only way it starts up again is if you then, after you've decimated the island with air attacks and with, ship-based missiles, you got to go in and seize it, and with bodies. And honestly, taking over Taiwan is not like rolling tanks across farmlands, Russia into Ukraine. It's more like D-Day. I mean, Thailand is a rock in the middle of the ocean. With on most of it, there are some beaches, but they're very small. Most of it is, is going to be, climbing the cliffs. And the objective of the U.S. and the West has been for some time now, let's make Taiwan look like a porcupine as much as possible. Make it look undigestible from a military standpoint. Like of course you're going to win it, but do you really want to go through all that? It's going to be a high price to pay. So that's why I think in the short and medium term, absent some incredibly provocative action, I don't think we have to worry about that. But I do think we need to be smart in terms of building our own capacity from a semiconductor standpoint, and having Taiwan, which they're doing in Texas and in Ohio and several states in the United States. They're building fab capacities. So in any event, that's where we are on that one. I would say that in terms of the U.S.-Russia relationship, U.S.-China relationship and the investment standpoint, what I worry about is less Taiwan and more the fact that you've got both the Democrats and the Republicans falling all over each other to show who can be tougher on China politically. And there's open discussion now about a reverse CFIUS process. Now, CFIUS is Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's the entity that has the ability, if a Chinese company wants to buy an American company or even a German company that has an American subsidiary, the U.S. government can stop that. If they believe there are national security implications to that purchase. So it's a dual use technology, something like that. And CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Reverse CFIUS, which is being discussed both in Congress and in the Biden administration, says not only are we going to stop China from buying certain things, we're going to stop U.S. investors from investing in Chinese companies if those companies are developing the kinds of materials that could be advantageous or used in a military context.
But aren't we effectively doing that by, for example, forbidding Nvidia from selling our most advanced chips to China or technologies and so forth, right?
We're dipping our toe in the water on that. But the reverse CFIUS would even say that funds like ours cannot invest in certain Chinese companies. And the last thing you want to do as an investor is be put in a place where all of a sudden you have to make a forced sale. Because the government takes some kind of action. So we're watching that pretty carefully. We do have investments in Chinese companies. I think there are a lot of companies that have absolutely nothing to do with the military, that have a lot to do with servicing the consumer demand of 1 billion people or 1.2 billion people. There's some good investments over there. And
you said it, the opportunity set of 1 billion people in there, right? They can buy a lot of our stuff. You can see Apple and Nike doing really well there. I want to go back a little bit and talk, because this is a really important thing for us. We invest a lot in technology, we invest a lot of communications. I think this week or this weekend, Montana passed a bill to ban TikTok, which, I think as you said, this is really the first time we've seen Democrats and Republicans come together on one issue, which is China is the bad guy, right? And I would like for you to kind of comment about, enemy versus adversary, right? Like they're not our enemy in essence, but they are an adversary. And now we're really treating them as they are the bad guy and trying to do all these things. What is that going to lead us to?
Well, I don't think in a good place. I'm very worried about the direction and the trajectory of our policy on China, because it is, I think it's a mistake for us to take the position that we are adversarial in every level. Yeah. I think we're clearly have an adversarial relationship when it relates to Taiwan, potentially, and the South China Sea. Yeah. But most of the other stuff, we're competitors, right? We're both pushing hard on AI. We're pushing hard on quantum computing. We're pushing hard on semiconductors and that kind of thing. And honestly, we're pushing hard on creating the kinds of products that the rest of the world is going to want to buy. So I think we need to be adversarial and this is the Biden administration policy. We're adversarial where we need to be, but fundamentally the overarching frame of the relationship should be that we're competitors. Right. And there are areas where we need to cooperate.
And do the Chinese, do the Chinese get that nuance? Because, from our standpoint, it feels like it's all or nothing, right? Because it's central government and so forth. Do the Chinese get that?
Well, they do and they don't. So they also get the importance of cooperating with us in certain areas. So climate change. Right. We are the biggest. We and China are the two biggest emitters. I mean, I'm sure, India's coming up pretty quick. Right. But we are not going to address climate change successfully without cooperation. Second is nuclear nonproliferation. Right. We need China to deal with North Korea. They do. North Korea does 90+% of its trade with China. We need China to deal with North Korea. We need China to deal with Iran, which is coming very close to breakout in terms of nuclear capability. And, China has worked to build a relationship with Iran. They just, helped reestablish the Saudi-Iranian ties. And we also need to work with them on whenever we get the next pandemic, to make sure that we have information sharing and we're working on it from day one and we don't, have 2 or 3 months go by before we really know what's going on like we did the last time, right? Yeah. So these are areas we need to work together with China. China gets all that. And they would prefer to have a better relationship with us. And unfortunately, in the last few months, it's just gone sideways. Right. So Biden met with Xi in October on the margins of the G20 in Indonesia, right? Yeah. They had a 3-hour meeting. Right. And the takeaway from that meeting is, okay, let's try to restore and rebuild some of the communication links that have fallen apart, particularly after the Pelosi visit. So we want to, let's get our mill-to-mill links, military-to-military links reestablished. Let's get at the working level of our government, start communicating again on some of the areas where we need to work together. And Tony Blinken was all set about a month and a half ago, to go to China and start that process. And then that damn balloon showed up.
I know. That was hilarious.
And so then everybody got all worked up. And by the way, the fact that we don't have the lines of communication we need with China, if that balloon came in from an ally or even a nation that's somewhat of a competitor or an adversary that we have working relationship with, pick up the phone, say, what the heck's going on? They go, oh, yikes, mistake. We'll deal with it. We'll get it out of your airspace or what have you. I mean, that did not happen here, which to me proves the point that we need to build those things. So the balloon shows up, and then there's all this pressure, shoot it down, shoot it down. And then Blinken cancels his trip. Yeah. And then we move into the Munich Security Conference. And at the Munich Security Conference, there was all this hope that Blinken and Wang Yi, who was at the time the Chinese foreign minister and is one of the more powerful people in the Chinese government, were going to sit down and meet and try to put this thing to bed and then set up a new set of meetings. Yeah. Well, it took, first of all, I saw Tony. I talked to him on Friday night, And this meeting was supposed to take place on Saturday. They didn't even know if they had the meeting yet. I mean,
wow.
Finally, they put the meeting together. Yep. It was 40 minutes. In these meetings, you're in a room with maybe 12 people, 6 on each side of a table. It's not simultaneous translation. It's seriatim translation, which means everything gets said twice in 2 different languages, which means 40 minutes is really 20 minutes. Split that in half. They each get 10 minutes, and all they did was yell at each other about the balloon.
Oh,
so,
no.
you know, nothing got accomplished there. Probably would have been better if they hadn't had the meeting. And now we're waiting for, and then, you know, China's coming to the conclusion that, well, because of the political situation in the U.S., it's going to be impossible to accomplish anything there. We're just going to push that aside and try to deepen our ties with Russia, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this is a dangerous time. And I get the politics of China. I get the appeal of tough on China from a political standpoint. But I think this is a dangerous enough time that we need to figure out how do we put some of this back together, so we're at least having the kinds of communications that you need to have in order to avoid a mistake spiraling into something different. And by that, I mean, if you're having military exercises and all of a sudden you get a trigger happy pilot on the other side, or you have an accidental, you know, collision or something along those lines, you know, if you don't have those lines of communication set, it makes it a much more potentially dangerous situation.
I must say it's a great insight, because I really don't know how these things work. But you're not making me feel very good about the fact that we're not engaged, because you would expect, you know, despite the rhetoric and the Twitterverse and, you know, the politicking, you would expect that he's, you know, calmer minds and spirits on the back end who are trying to really kind of bring things down. You don't think that's happening right now?
Well, I think there's an effort on our side to make it happen. I think that on the Chinese side, there's a desire to make it happen. They wanted that Blinken meeting to happen.
Right.
One reason they're mad is that we canceled it. And so on the Chinese side, I think there's a little bit of petulance going on, and sort of a sense, well, we're going to use this opportunity to really build the ties with Putin. But ironically, it may get to a point where China would be useful in putting pressure on Putin to, at a minimum, get to some sort of a frozen conflict in this Ukraine situation, which is, I think, where we're going to probably end up, a frozen conflict with flashes of kinetic military activity and counterinsurgency, such as we saw with like the blowing up of that bridge to Crimea.
I'm glad you said that. So that's kind of what we should expect, or hopeful to expect, that we'll get to a point where the Chinese maybe get some kind of negotiations in place and the Russian and the Ukrainian will start speaking. Is that?
Well, you need China to pressure Putin.
Right.
I mean, China's not going to be the, come together and they don't have credibility. They're clearly on Putin's side on this.
Right.
So but they need to say that, okay, Vladimir, enough is enough. Let's see if we can work this thing out. And then the question will be whether the allies bring pressure on Zelensky. So when I said before the question about how do you define win, Zelensky has publicly defined win as pushing Russia out of every square inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. I'm not so sure that the NATO allies would endorse that. I think if we got back to something that looked like the status quo ante of where we were after, or before that invasion, where we were after 2014, it might be okay. Let's see if we can live with that. We're not going to acknowledge that Russia, in effect, that Crimea is part of Russia, but it's not worth the military fight, loss of lives, treasure, etc., to try to push Russia out of Crimea. And so let's sort of see where we are. But we would, at that time, we would need to give Ukraine some sort of security guarantee, short of NATO membership. They are not going to join NATO. I can tell you that flat out. NATO is like fire insurance. You can't buy fire insurance when your house is on fire. And their house is on fire right now.
I mean, that's why Finland just jumped in, right? And Sweden is trying.
Very smart.
right? Yeah.
And Sweden would like to jump in. The problem is you've got Erdogan in Turkey, who, you know, as far as he's concerned, every Kurd is a terrorist, and Sweden has had some, you know, pro-Kurdish demonstrations or whatever, and so that, you know, he's playing games there. We'll see what happens after his election.
Great. Fascinating story. Since you were in Germany for a long time, and obviously you know how Europe works, I was super surprised to see how well Europe managed the energy crisis, because they were getting most of their energy from Russia. Can you elaborate on that? Can you see kind of where things are going? I mean, we're big investor in alternative energies and green energy and so forth. So I think that's also been a good thing from silver lining from this war. But can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, and there, you know, I'll give you, there are multiple factors that happened simultaneously, not the least of which was a mild winter.
That's right.
But, you know, I'm good friends with Olaf Scholz as chief of staff. Scholz is the new chancellor, Wolfgang Schmidt. I met with him about, you know, a month after the invasion occurred last year. And he was all in winter is coming mode. They were very worried about how they were going to get through winter. Then I met with him in September, and they were pretty copacetic about this winter. They were worried about next winter. And then when I met with him a third time in Munich this February, they're okay with next winter too. And there's several things that have happened, but they're worried more about what happens in 3, 4, 5 years, because it's a long time. You know, Germany got up to 55% of their natural gas was provided by Russia.
Right.
So that's a lot to replace.
Sure.
So several things happen simultaneously. Number one, I think with the fear and with the increase in price of gas, there was a lot more conservation of gas in Germany than people expected, particularly not just in the summer, but the winter months. So their storage capacity, not capacity, but their actual storage levels of gas are almost where you would expect them to be at the beginning of the next winter after a full summer of putting gas in storage. They're at about 75% of full capacity, which is remarkable for being in a place where they're coming out of winter. Right. So that was in part because of conservation, and it was in part because of a mild winter. So that's a better place. Second thing, in less than 190 days, they were able to build their first LNG, liquefied natural gas, regasification plant on the North Sea. So, you know, now that's more expensive than getting the pipeline gas from Russia. But, you know, you get it liquefied from places like the United States or Qatar or Portugal or other places, or even Japan. And it comes over, and then they regasify it and put it in the pipelines to go to Germany. They now have 5 of those floating regasification plants, 4 of them in the North Sea, 1 in the Baltic. And they're, by November, they told me they're going to have a 6th in the Baltic. So that helps. But that only accounts for about 20% of the gas that they lost, but still or 20% of their needs. Third thing is they're getting 40% of their gas now from Norway through a pipeline that goes through the Baltic. Now, that's good news. The bad news is we've seen how vulnerable these pipelines can be to a terrorist explosion, right? With what happened with Nord Stream 1 and part of Nord Stream 2. So you
can you speculate on what happened to Nord Stream 1 without putting on the spot?
I think what the way the intelligence seems to be moving is it was most likely a rump group of pro-Ukrainians, not sponsored by the Ukrainian government, but people who, and the irony is that actually doesn't necessarily help Ukraine, because what it could do is put more pressure on Europeans, because they're getting less gas to get angrier and maybe not support Ukraine as much. So, but in any event, I think that's probably my second choice would be that Russia did it. And and you might say, well, why would they blow up their own stuff? The reason is that it is very important for Vladimir Putin to be able to say to the rest of the world, we are a reliable provider of your energy needs, regardless of what's happening geopolitically. And Putin, remember, started playing games with, I'm going to shut down the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which has been going since like the early 2000s. I'm going to shut that down, because it needs maintenance. And everybody knew that was ridiculous after a while. And you can only play those games so long. But if a thing blows up, I'd love to give you the gas. I just can't. So, so they'd be a target. But I think the most likely is that. So now you got Germany getting the pipeline. Now, if I'm Russia, I might want to blow that up. I might want to blow up the NATO pipeline. So the Norway pipeline. But Norway and Germany are both NATO member states.
Sure.
So what they've done working with NATO is they can't really protect that pipeline.
Yeah.
But they can increase, and they have the surveillance
along
the pipeline, so that if anybody gets cute and tries to do something, they'll be able to detect it, and then they'll be able to know who the perpetrator is. And because they're all NATO countries, it's an attack on infrastructure like that could trigger Article 5. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, blah, blah, blah. So, but anyway, so they're getting gas there. So that's the second. The third thing they've done, the final thing they've done, is they have put the move towards renewables, which you're saying you're investing in, on a super highway. And as Jörg Kukas, who's Olaf Scholz's top economic minister, told me, that super highway is the Autobahn with no speed limit. I mean, they're really moving forward with the renewables. I'll give you two examples. First of all, in the wind farm area, they now require every one of the 16 German states to devote 2% of their land mass to wind farm development.
It's amazing.
And as it relates to new wind farms, it used to be a 7-year process to get a permit to put them in. It's now 1 year. Wow. They've had major permit reform, which, by the way, is something I think we could do here in the United States on a lot of fronts.
For sure, right?
So, and the second thing they did was, if you have an existing wind farm, you used to have to go and re-permit every new windmill you wanted to put on that wind farm, and even every upgrade. So you got, some of these things are 15 years old, right? So you got a new higher tech, uses less energy, creates more energy. You'd have to go get a permit. Now, if you have a permit for a wind farm, you can put as many as you want up there, and you can upgrade them. No requirement to go to the government to get approval. And then the third thing they did, which is kind of interesting, is because of concern about killing birds, their turbines moved very, very slowly, which meant they didn't create a lot. So they changed the law so that the only way, a judge or environmental group or whatever could force the windmill to slow down is if they can prove that an endangered species is likely to go extinct because of that particular windmill. So now these suckers have sped up, so they're generating a lot more energy. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is, well, how do you get that energy to the places it needs to be?
Right.
There's a lot more wind in the northern part of Germany. Well, there's some in the south, but they need much of the industrial part is in the west and the south of Germany. And, local groups, think NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard, have been protesting and preventing the big power lines that are needed to deliver that energy for years. And so now they've done permitting reform there. They're driving through the creation of these power lines. And from an optical standpoint, they're calling them freedom lines to try to make it more palatable. You're not a patriot if you don't have a freedom line going through your farmland. So that's kind of how they've been dealing with it. The concern is, as I said, you do have vulnerabilities like that, the Norway pipeline. And the other concern is, what if, we end up with 2 or 3 really bad winters in a row? Climate change, you can't, it goes in different directions. And
hindsight,
you got to supply Hungary and you got to supply Austria, both of which are highly dependent on Russian gas.
So France has, I think, 65 or 70% of its energy come from nuclear, while Germany basically shut down most of their nuclear plants over the last 20 years or so. Hindsight, obviously 2020, did Germany actually make the wrong bet? Is that
yes,
they did?
And in fact, I even talked to some Greens, senior people in the Green Party, who said, in retrospect, we should have worried about getting coal out of the system before we shut down nuclear, because nuclear is pretty clean. And the problem is the Green Party, which is now in government, nuclear is their sort of raison d'etre, right? It was to stop nuclear was how they got started back in 40 years ago in
the irony, right?
Whatever name, you know, in that era. And so that's a real concern is that I think Germany had 6 nuclear power plants. They're incredibly clean, incredible high technology. They decommissioned 3 of them a year ago, and the 3 more were supposed to be decommissioned this December. They actually kicked it over to the end of this month, April, like next week. And now they'll be decommissioned, and that's that. The problem with France is about 1/3 of their nuclear power plants are either not operational or in need of great repair. So I mean, they got to clean up their act over there. They could be be a savior. The irony, of course, is Germany shuts it down only to use more nuclear power from France.
From France, yeah, it was crazy, right? Fascinating stuff. I want to shift gears a little bit. You have so much information, great information. Like a lot of the questions we're getting these days about the de-dollarization, or at least the loss of, the power that the dollar has, one from maybe the Chinese making deals with the Russians, with the yuan, and the Brazilians as well, and so forth. Like, where do we stand? Like, is the dollar losing its luster? Is it just a bunch of gold hawks trying to sell more gold? Like, where are we with that conversation?
I think we're a long way away from absolute de-dollarization. You do see Xi Jinping would love to have, kind of change have their currency be the popular traded currency. You say Russia now saying, well, that's what we're going to use, et cetera. But let me tell you, particularly during times of geopolitical anxiety and tension, people want that safe haven of the U.S. dollar. Right. And so I think it's something that's interesting to talk about and look at, and you can't take it for granted, but I think we're a long way away from that.
Yeah, I tend to agree on that. Let's talk a little bit about the U.S. Obviously, we have a presidential election coming up. Where do we stand? Like, is Biden going to run again? I know we've had you here before the last presidential election. You had some great insights. I'll speak for most voters that I talk to. I think everyone is tired of Trump or Biden. I think people want some new energy, new blood. Then, this maybe has some of my own kind of biases. But where do you stand with that? Where are we? Where are we going?
I think all those people are going to be disappointed because I think we're looking at a rematch.
Really? Wow.
For sure, Biden is running again. I mean, he's almost come to the point of announcing it. Very, very clear. And, their view, it's a different place from where we were a year ago when, the sense was you just came out of that disastrous Afghan thing. You haven't gotten your legislative package through. Real concern about the Democrats are going to get slammed in the midterms. Yeah. Now Biden he had one of the most productive legislative years, including a lot of bipartisan legislation nobody thought he could get done. Gun safety regulation.
Right.
Doesn't seem to make much difference, tragically, as we see every week there's another shooting. But in any event, gun safety regulation, infrastructure package, the CHIPS Act, and the bipartisan support for what he's done with Ukraine. The Afghan pullout has been sort of eclipsed by the positive view of how he's pulled together the allies in response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So he gets points for that. And then on the electoral front, despite the fact people were complaining with his the way he was campaigning and, he's not talking enough about the economy, talking more about abortion and extremism. Well, that ended up working. Right. And the Democrats came within 5 seats of holding the House, which is nothing short of miraculous. And he even gained a seat in the Senate. So, so now a lot of Democrats are going, well, he's old. We wish he wasn't that old. We wish he didn't look that old, but he seems to be doing pretty well. And here's the thing, he's much more of a moderate than many of the people who are lined up in the Democratic Party to challenge him. Yeah. And so the concern is you could end up with a nominee who's too far left to win those handful of swing states that are going to determine this election. So I think Biden runs, and apart from a couple of gadflies, you have RFK Jr. and you have what's the name, Marianne Williamson, that have jumped into this thing. Apart from a couple of gadflies who aren't going to get a single delegate, neither one of them, Biden gets the nomination. So now you go to the Republican side, and the truth is that there are two important mathematical facts in Republican primary politics. One is that a majority of Republican primary voters, even though they like Trump, would prefer to see someone other than Trump run, or be the nominee. The second reality, though, is that Donald Trump has an absolute ironclad hold on anywhere between 35 and 45% of the Republican primary electorate.
Sure.
Now, that's enough to not enough to get you to a majority. But the truth is that it is enough to get you to win the nomination. Why? Because in a multi-candidate field, the Republican primary process does not award delegates to the convention on the basis of proportionality. They wear them at first across the post, winner takes all. That's how they award them. So if Trump gets 38% of the vote and DeSantis or whoever gets 36 and somebody else gets 24, he gets all the delegates. And I'll tell you, there's another dynamic to that. Because some people say, well, Trump would lose if it was a one-on-one, if you had somebody running against him. So we have several candidates running. What if after the first couple of primaries, they drop out and then you end up with a one-on-one dynamic? I'll tell you what, I think Donald Trump has got the Republican voters, elected officials and Republican Party stalwarts so freaked out that they don't want to see him be president and they weren't for him. I think you could see after a couple of primaries, if he winning them, huge consolidation around him. And they would, of course, see Biden, having a consolidation. So I think it is, sure, if he gets one-on-one right out of the box, it's possible he could lose. But and we're beginning to see this happen with DeSantis a little bit, with his numbers starting to go down. The Mike Tyson rule. Everybody's got a plan until you punch him in the face.
I just heard this weekend. Someone told me this weekend.
And so I would say, and of course, this indictment of the various things that he's being investigated for is clearly the weakest of those various cases. But that indictment is going to help the Republican Party coalesce around him. He even has his opponents, saying this is outrageous. So you even have Mitt Romney, who voted to throw him out of office, voted to convict him, saying this is out of control. So basically, but here's the bottom line: it almost doesn't matter who the nominees are. Okay, and I'll tell you why. You need to have 270 electoral votes to be president of the United States. If you tell me, you name any state, I can tell you with certainty on 44 states whether they're going to be red or blue, regardless of who the nominee is. 44 states. There's 6 of them that I can't say that about. And by the way, when I do my certainty on the 44, neither candidate gets to 270. They only get to 270 by winning probably 3 or maybe 4 of those 6 states. What are those 6 states? They're the 3 in the Midwest that Hillary lost, that Democrats usually win: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, that Trump won, and then Biden won. And they're the 2 in the Arizona and Georgia that Republicans usually win, that Trump lost very closely, but he lost the last time. And then I would throw Nevada in that, because Nevada is now super close. It's a clearly purple state. So those are the 6 states. And here's the other thing that's a little sobering. Fewer than 100,000 people spread out among those 6 states will determine who the next president is.
Man, that sucks.
Look, in 2020, if 25,000 people in Wisconsin, 10,000 in Arizona, 10,000 in Georgia had voted for Trump instead of Biden, Trump would have been president, despite losing the popular vote by 8 million votes. And in 2016, if 65,000 people spread out in the right numbers of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin had voted for Hillary, she would have been president. So I'm telling you, fewer people than you can fit in an NFL stadium on any given Sunday in the fall are going to determine the presidency. A weather event in the Midwest that impacts turnout could determine the presidency. So now it's not as completely illogical as all that. I would say if you want something to look at, if the economy, if it's not even what the numbers are doing, it's how people are feeling. But if people are feeling that the economy is coming back and doing pretty well and they're not as anxious about their future, it'll be very hard to beat Joe Biden. And if people are feeling that if we end up with a Fed overreaching and all of a sudden we're plunged into a big recession in the middle of 2024, it'll be very hard for Biden to get reelected. So, I mean, those are overarching things. But even with all that, those numbers that I talked about, that's the numbers we're looking at. So what I would say to your, your clients and your colleagues is, just don't get all spun up over this news story or that news story, or there's another indictment, or this guy's up in the polls or down in the polls or jumping. It doesn't matter. It's all going to come down to a handful of people, and we're not going to know who the next president is until probably 2 or 3 days after the 2024 election.
Man, those were some sobering facts. Democracy at work in America.
Yeah, exactly. Democracy at work in a polarized country.
Yeah, right. Super unfortunate. I'd be remiss if I did not ask you about the impact of this divisiveness in our country and how that's gonna impact our ability as a country to really kind of lead the world. Like, people look at us from all across the world as really the leader, and there is a power vacuum happening. How is that? How are we setting the stage when we can't really get our house in order in effect?
Well, it doesn't help. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. If we're out there banging the drum for democracy,
right,
and we can't even have a smooth transition of power because people are, declaring fraud in the election or whatever, that undercuts, our ability. If we're talking about, the importance of democracy, and we're, just constantly fighting, that certainly doesn't help things. And, what was really interesting when you talk about global leadership was the reaction of the global South to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So there was a vote in the UN to condemn Russian aggression, right? Obviously, the United States and the NATO member states and the EU were strongly in favor of that, as was China, as was Korea. But countries representing a majority of the people on this planet didn't vote for it.
Right.
China didn't vote for it, obvious reasons. India didn't vote for it.
Yeah.
Many of the African nations didn't vote for it. Many of the Latin American nations didn't vote for it. And so then you had the United States and others reaching out to states in the global South and saying, hey, come on, guys, this is in your interest. You don't want big, powerful nations to just willy-nilly be able to invade other countries. And their attitude is, you know what? That's your problem. And we're mad at you guys. And let me tell you why. Number one, we noticed that there's a real big difference with how the Europeans, for instance, are treating Ukrainian refugees and how you treat refugees from the global South.
Right.
Whether it's immigrants trying to get into the United States from Latin America, or whether it's, people escaping Africa and famine and that kind of thing, trying to go across the Mediterranean into Europe. And also thinking back to Syrian refugees and Afghan refugees back in 2015, 2016, when that was such a big deal in Europe. So that's point number one. Point number two, you guys keep promising us stuff and you don't deliver. You promised us a lot of high quality vaccines. You didn't deliver that. Right. You promised us a lot of food and to help us. And now this war in Ukraine and the way you're all handling it hasn't helped us on that. And we're, we've got huge famine in certain parts of the global South, particularly in Africa. And then the third thing is sort of a pox on all your houses, because, the way we, the global South, have been treated by, the industrial north, or however you want to describe it,
Yep.
is, you guys come in, you grab up all our natural resources, and then you take off again.
Yeah.
And you maybe pay off some bribes and whatever, but you haven't done anything to help grow our economies. So there's definitely that hurts.
Paying for our sins.
And the good news, and this was a little bit of a silver lining that came out of the Munich Security Conference, there was much more discussion, certainly among the nations that you would consider part of the West, about the need to reach out to the global South and do a much better job in helping, those countries benefit from. And by the way, there's an opportunity here with the idea of nearshoring supply chains.
Yeah.
If you're in Europe, Africa, pretty quick.
Yeah.
If you're in, the U.S., Latin America, at least you're in the same hemisphere. Sure. So there's some real opportunities there as well. But we're a long way from making that happen. And you're absolutely right in that, what people see on television, in effect, and read about, it does undermine our leadership. That being said, we've done a pretty good job of pulling the world together to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine.
I have to ask you, and this is a question that comes up a lot, about the debt ceiling. I think June, sometime July, maybe, we have this conversation. The debt ceiling, in essence, is basically us being able to pay for really what we promised to pay for, but it's going to become a conversation. And I think last time happened 2011, the U.S. when we did not raise the debt ceiling, and the U.S. credit got downgraded, and the markets went into a kind of a free fall. What do you think we are there? Can we get a deal done? Can Biden get a deal done with the Republicans?
Well, I mean, first of all, don't forget that the Democrats allowed Donald Trump and the Republicans in the Congress 3 different times without negotiating any deal to raise the debt ceiling during Trump's presidency. Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
So you have a lot of Democrats that are saying in Congress that are saying, you guys should do the same thing. This is not new spending. This is, cashing checks that Congress has already written. You guys voted for in many instances, because a lot of what we're paying now was part of the COVID relief efforts during the Trump years that had bipartisan support. So, so in any event, that's part of the dynamic that's going on. I think the Biden approach is we're not going to negotiate on debt ceiling, but we understand we do need to negotiate on the budget. Right. And fundamentally, and the Republicans are talking about getting a hold of spending and so on and so forth. It's a budget issue. It's not a debt ceiling. That money's already spent. Yeah. So, it's a little bit of, we're not going to negotiate on the debt ceiling, but we are willing to negotiate on this. And so Biden put out his budget. Yeah. And he's waiting for McCarthy to come back with the Republican budget. So they have something to negotiate about. But unfortunately, McCarthy has not yet been able to do that. Yeah, because the demands of that very narrow group of people that he had to do a deal with to get the speakership, because his margin was so small, the demands for restoring a budget basically leave, if you leave military intact and you leave Social Security and Medicare intact, you have to literally wipe out every other part of the federal budget to achieve their goals. I mean, literally. Yeah. So you're not going to do that math. So the question is, Biden administration don't want to negotiate against themselves. So they're putting out, here's our budget. Go ahead and show us yours, and then we can talk. Now, at the end of the day, notwithstanding all this talk about we need a clean debt ceiling or whatever, at the end of the day, if there's a deal to be had, will they swallow that and get the deal? I'm sure they will. Yeah. But you can't have a deal until the other side's willing to come to the table with something concrete that's not, pie in the sky stuff. So that's kind of what they're waiting for. And I'm nervous about it because there are enough people. Here's the trick, the political trick. So McCarthy, in order to be elected speaker, had to give this handful of Freedom Caucus Republicans the right to, any individual has the right to challenge his speakership. Wow. And basically throw him out. Okay. not one person can throw them out, but they can call for a vote. And we saw it took them 15 times to get it last time.
Yeah.
So one person can do that. So the question is, and they all negotiated that he would not do a deal with Biden on the budget unless it hits certain benchmarks, which are benchmarks that are almost impossible to achieve, particularly with a Democratic president. Okay. So the question is, how do you thread that needle? How does, I don't think the debt ceiling gets solved with McCarthy and Biden doing a big deal and coming up and say, okay, everybody's going to vote for it. I think the debt ceiling gets solved with Biden giving enough to get a few Republicans on board.
Yeah.
And McCarthy being able to feel that he got enough that his speakership doesn't end. So it's, and then he brings the thing to a vote. Most Republicans vote against it, but all the Democrats and a handful of Republicans are able to vote for it, and we deal with the debt ceiling. I think that's the ultimate resolution. And the needle that, or the needle that has to be threaded is one that gives enough to get a handful of Republicans, but not so little that the Freedom House people or Freedom Caucus people just say, okay, you're out of here, McCarthy. How does he do a deal that allows him to bring the thing to a vote and doesn't lose him his job? That's the challenge. And
there is a path, but it's narrow.
It's a challenge of his own making.
Wow. There is a path, but it's very, very narrow. It's been an amazing conversation. I want to end it on a positive note because it is a lot of very complicated things that are going on, a lot of, things that we have to work through. In the words of Warren Buffett, you never bet against America. I think if you looked at capital markets and, Capital Group's been around for 100 years plus, I think, and you guys have seen it all, World War II to inflation and so forth, somehow markets have always been able to get through these times. Can you kind of give us some positive things to look to so we can kind of try to forget some of all these negative things that are happening right now?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's an exciting time to be an investor. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've got enormous, think about the healthcare field. Yeah. Think about what's happening from the standpoint of biotechnology. Yeah. You've got enormous opportunities and exciting opportunities in that area. Think about artificial intelligence and the changes in technology there. Think about the ability to grow more and more food on smaller and smaller pieces of property with less and less water, and the need not to be covering them with pesticides. I mean, that kind of research is happening. That's extraordinary. Think about the billions of dollars that are going into the green tech area, and and creating not just the specific, for instance, as an example, everybody knows about Tesla and its electric vehicles. Well, it's not just the electric vehicles. It's also creating the storage thing that you can put in your garage and save the energy that comes in from your solar panels or what have you. I mean, there are knock-on effects of a lot of this research that's going on that are very, very exciting. Global literacy, highest ever in history. Global poverty, lowest ever in history. You look at the developing world and the opportunity for growth there. They are leapfrogging the bricks and mortar component of what we all had to do and build as we were developing and, the last couple of 100 years. They're leapfrogging it because of technology. Sure. You can do things virtually now. You can they're now, do they need a bank to go into? If you're living in Nigeria, hell no, you just do it all on your phone. Yeah. And I mean, it's extraordinary when you travel as I do, and you just see, even in areas where there's a pretty dramatic poverty, people got their cell phones and they're doing business with that. And so, so I think there's, and then here's the other thing. They're always concerned about overpopulation and all that. That seems to be cresting now. I've seen several articles about that recently. So I think that there's actually some very, very exciting opportunities out there. And I think the world is in a much better place. You know, it's interesting. My kids always will come up to me, or not always, but periodically say, "Oh my gosh, Dad, this is worse. Has it ever been worse? It's just terrible." I go, "Ever been worse? I mean, hey, I grew up in the 60s. We were shooting our political leaders. We were rioting in the streets. You had the convulsion of the combination of the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. I mean, convulsion in terms of the impact on society and just the change that rapidly happening changes that people were having to kind of cope with and deal with and what have you. And then, you know, I mean, those were crazy times. And actually things are a lot better now. The one thing I worry about the most, though, is this this fact that we can't seem to agree on basic facts.
Sure.
And you have these alternative universes and bubbles and silos. Now, you always used to have that. I mean, you have that famous scene from the movie Citizen Kane, where the William Randolph Hearst character is at one end, is kind of a Vladimir Putin table, one end of a long table, and his wife, from whom he's pretty much estranged at this point, at the other end, and she's reading the opposing newspaper. This one was the conservative one, this was the liberal one. Okay, so depending on what newspapers you got in the old days, you got, but fundamentally we had 3 channels on television. You had Walter Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley or whomever, and they were all, you know, you had the sense they're giving you fully vetted set of facts of what's happening in the world. And now everybody's just getting their news and information from all sorts of sources. And there's very little vetting of that that goes on. I mean, you know, the whole idea of, well, it must be true. I read it on the internet. Well, who put it out there? What's the basis for that? And I think that we need to do everything we can to get away from this dynamic where people only seem to communicate and discuss and have conversations with people who see the world as exactly as they do. And I honestly think that the algorithms of social media are a lot to blame on that. And that is something that needs to be resolved. You know, it's like the more there's so many studies that the more you respond to anger, the more you're going to get things that are going to continue to make you angry. You know, that's how it all works. So, so I'd say I worry about that, but fundamentally, I'm not only bullish on America, I'm bullish on the world and bullish on the investment opportunities. I was just talking to someone at breakfast this morning. You know, now is a pretty good time to start investing. You know, again. So,
well, thank you for that amazing insight, the candor. You know, when I talk to people like yourself, you know, I really get excited about, hey, there is a lot of stuff to look at, to look at. This world is complex in general, but there is a lot of opportunities out there. So thank you guys for being stewards of our capital, for, you know, coming on and giving us your time. I'll definitely be reaching out again to ask some more questions. But we appreciate everything you do for us. And thank you for
thank you so much. And thanks for having me. And thanks for our long partnership.